The power dynamics within the British monarchy are often shrouded in tradition, but beneath the golden surface lies a cold, calculated machinery that determines who truly holds influence. A monumental conflict has recently emerged, one that involves a formal, desperate appeal from Queen Camilla to Prince William. The core of the struggle is not merely about family feelings or hurt pride. It is about the most fundamental right in the transition of power, the right to be in a room when the future of the monarchy is designed. Camilla sought to secure her place in the private planning sessions for William's future reign, but she was met with a refusal so absolute and a legal safeguard so final that it shattered the long-standing expectations of her role. This story begins in a private planning meeting, a space traditionally reserved for the most senior members of the firm. It was supposed to be a session focused on mundane logistics, the unglamorous, yet essential tasks that ensure the monarchy continues to function seamlessly. There were discussions about administrative coordination, security briefings, and the complex interplay between different royal households. Prince William walked in, expecting a routine, forward-looking discussion regarding his eventual ascension. Princess was present, providing her usual razor-sharp clarity. Camilla entered the room, expecting to participate as she always had during Charles's reign. However, when she posed a question regarding her consultation rights under William's future rule, the atmosphere shifted instantly. She wasn't asking for information. She was asking for a permanent seat at the table of his future sovereignty. William did not dismiss her immediately, but he did not offer the guarantee she desired. He respected her years of service beside the king. Yet he was unwilling to mortgage the independence of his future reign to satisfy the needs of the present one. It was at this moment that Princess N, the most formidable strategist in the royal family, intervened. She did not raise her voice. She simply closed her notebook and set the stage for what would become an immutable rule. She argued that access to future planning must be based solely on constitutional role and active responsibility, not on marriage history or emotional closeness to the current sovereign. The weight of this intervention cannot be overstated. Camilla, initially believing this was merely a family disagreement she could sway with charm or influence, soon realized she was facing a wall of logic that she could not penetrate. When she finally discovered that it was not just the administration, but Prince William himself who had approved and strengthened this restriction, the betrayal was palpable. She had hoped that a private appeal would soften the stance. Instead, she found that the future king had personally ensured that no petition, no matter how heartfelt, could reopen the doors she had spent years opening. This was not an impulsive decision made in the heat of an argument. It was a carefully structured policy shift. William recognized that as the heir preparing his own household, the authority to define the boundaries of his future reign rested entirely with him. He saw clearly that if the circles of authority between his father's reign and his own continued to overlap, the monarchy would suffer from a lack of direction at the very moment it required absolute stability. By codifying these access rules, William was not just closing a door on Camilla, he was protecting the integrity of his own future institution. For Camilla, this was a devastating realization. For years, she had navigated the complex waters of palace life, moving from a controversial figure to a respected consort. She had expected that her loyalty would translate into a permanent, influential role in the inner circle of the future monarchy. To be told that she would be sidelined, not out of malice, but out of a calculated need for structural independence, was a bitter pill to swallow. She had believed she had earned a permanent seat, but the reality was that the rules of the institution were being rewritten to prevent exactly that. As she faced the silence that followed her request, she began to understand that the transition of power would not be a continuation of the past, but a departure from it. The doors that once opened for her were closing one by one, signaling a future where her influence would be limited, and her role in the inner workings of the monarchy would be strictly defined by the boundaries the future king had set. This is a story of the quiet, yet profound, shift in the power of the British throne. The morning after a palace decision is rarely marked by dramatic proclamations. Instead, it reveals itself in the quiet, agonizing details of everyday routine. Meetings still commence, briefing folders still circulate through the corridors, and official cars continue to leave through the grand gates. Yet, for Queen Camilla, the true cruelty of the new protocol was exposed in its absolute silence. She sat at her desk, open her revised daily schedule, and notice a glaring absence. A future planning meeting that had once been a permanent fixture in her agenda was completely gone. The new access rules were no longer theoretical concepts debated in closed-door meetings. They were actively being enforced, drawing an unyielding line between the communications tied to King Charles's present reign and the strategic blueprints connected to Prince William's future one. Camilla still stood steadfast beside the king, fulfilling her public duties with unwavering grace. Nothing had erased her present place at his side, and her official standing within the current court remained entirely secure. However, the architecture of the future was moving forward without her, engineered by an heir who refused to compromise his vision. She closed her leather-bound diary before turning another page, her senior aide waiting anxiously nearby, uncertain whether she would demand an explanation or instruct him to challenge the omission. Camilla did neither. With a quiet resignation that weighed heavier than any outburst, she simply said, "Leave it." Those two words carried a profound surrender, marking the moment she realized that fighting the inevitable would only deepen the divide. Word of her silence eventually reached Prince William through a confidential briefing from a senior courtier. The prince had anticipated anger, perhaps even another formal protest, or an attempt to rally familial sympathy. Instead, what he heard sounded frighteningly like defeat. For the first time, the human cost of his decision stopped being an abstract political calculation and transformed into something deeply personal and uncomfortable. Princess recognized this shifting emotional landscape as well. In a private conversation with her nephew, she offers sharp, sobering warning. Firmness and cruelty were not the same thing, and he now risked confusing the two. While she fully defended the necessity of the boundary, she warned him that allowing scheduling software and cold administrative notices to deliver the final message turned a necessary institutional safeguard into an avoidable humiliation. Coming from the very person who had pushed hardest for restriction, this warning could not be ignored. Acknowledging that silence had gone too far, William finally agreed to a direct, private meeting with Camilla. There were no officials present, no administrative files on the table, and no third parties to soften the blow. Stripped of palace formalities, the two figures at the center of the storm confronted the raw reality of the succession. Camilla did not beg for the decision to be reversed. Instead, she asked a question that cut straight to the core of their relationship, whether this absolute rejection meant he no longer trusted her. William paused, weighing his words carefully before answering. He assured her that the decision was not a reflection of personal animosity or a challenge to her loyalty, but rather a structural necessity about where one reign must end and another must be permitted to begin. He admitted his own flaw in handling the aftermath with excessive coldness, driven by a fear that showing any warmth would be misconstrued as weakness or hesitation. He wanted absolute clarity, but in shielding his future boundary, he had forced his stepmother to absorb an institutional verdict as a personal rejection. He acknowledged her immense resilience beside his father, yet stood firm on the principle that his upcoming reign could not be anchored to influence derived from the past. Listening intently, Camilla made a defining choice of her own. She chose not to fight a war she could no longer win. By withdrawing her challenge, she did not mean that the pain had vanished, but rather that she finally understood the heavy responsibility William was carrying. This mutual acknowledgement transformed the tense atmosphere in the room. Although nothing had been formally reversed, something essential had been quietly repaired behind closed doors. Yet, while peace was tentatively forged inside the palace walls, the outside world was about to erupt. The rejection had leaked beyond the secure confines of the royal household, transforming a private family boundary into a massive public referendum on the future of the British monarchy. By morning, the private family struggle had escaped the walls of the palace and mutated into a public referendum on the future of the monarchy. The news of Camilla's rejection hit the headlines with the force of an institutional earthquake. Broadcasters and commentators across the globe analyzed the implications, framing William's refusal as the clearest sign, yet that the next reign would be defined strictly by his own terms, not by the inherited networks of Charles. Camilla suddenly found herself cast in a complicated light, simultaneously a figure of sympathy for some and a symbol of outdated influence for others. Princess Anne's quiet confirmation that the decision was final transformed the narrative from a mere palace disagreement into an irreversible judgment. leaving no room for speculation about a future reversal. William woke to a media storm that had already spiraled beyond palace control. Palace communications teams scrambled to stress continuity, desperately trying to reassure the public that Camilla's current responsibilities beside the king remained intact. They emphasized that nothing had erased her vital role in the present reign. Yet, the distinction remained painfully clear. While she belonged to the present, she was firmly locked out of the future. The public reaction was polarized. Camilla's supporters were outraged, viewing the restriction as a cold, ungrateful reward for her years of dedicated service under intense scrutiny. To them, the prince's actions felt like a premature dismissal of the woman who had helped rebuild the institution's image. In contrast, William's defenders argued that a future king who refused to establish necessary boundaries simply to avoid family discomfort would enter his throne already compromised. They saw his firmness as the ultimate proof of his readiness to lead. Outside the palace gates, the argument became impossible to ignore. Crowds gathered, cameras captured every movement, and newspapers featured side-by-side images of the future king and the queen, with headlines reading William says N.O. hovering above their faces. During a street interview, a bystander captured the mood perfectly by noting that it felt as though the next reign had already begun in spirit. That single sentence resonated across the nation, far better than hours of professional commentary. Princess became the central figure in this debate, as her stoic confirmation that the decision was irreversible signaled to the world that this was not a temporary disciplinary measure, but a permanent structural shift. Behind the headline, however, the four individuals at the center of the storm had reached a much quieter, more complex understanding. William had explained his position. Camilla had formally withdrawn her challenge and had defended the boundary with unwavering logic, and Charles had begun the difficult task of accepting what the future required. To the outside world, there were winners and losers, but in reality, the outcome was far more nuanced. It was not a victory for William or a defeat for Camilla. It was a mutual acceptance of a reality that no one could change. William accepted the heavy burden of authority. Camilla accepted that her service did not guarantee permanent influence, and Charles accepted that he could no longer rearrange the future to suit the present. The appeal was definitively closed, the ruling stood, and no relationship remained entirely untouched, yet the monarchy endured. What lingered in the aftermath was not open hostility, but a deliberate, careful distance. Camilla continued to appear beside Charles at state functions and maintained her patronages without visible complaint. However, those close to the household noted subtle, permanent shifts. Certain documents stopped appearing on her desk. Inquiries about future planning meetings, which once would have been standard, simply ceased. The palace did not announce these changes. They simply became the new normal. This quiet normalization was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal, as it signaled that the boundary was no longer even a subject for negotiation. William, for his part, did not gloat. He treated the episode with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of his future crown. He admitted to a senior advisor that saying no to the woman who had stood beside his father for decades had aged him in ways he had not expected, but he never apologized for the outcome. He remained convinced that the monarchy required absolute clarity more than it required comfort. As for Anne, she never revisited the issue. In her view, the institution had successfully withstood a critical test precisely because no one had been permitted to navigate around the boundary. The public eventually moved on to other stories, as they always do, but the precedent set in those private rooms remained firmly in place. It now sits at the heart of the monarchy's machinery, waiting for the inevitable moment when the crown passes and the next reign begins. Camilla will remain by Charles's side until the end, respected and present, but she will no longer be in the room where the future is plotted. The door, once open, is now closed, not as an act of cruelty, but as a final, structural truth.